They watched us for centuries from the edge of the void, cloaked in shadow, unseen by satellites, untraceable to telescopes. The Velkar Dominion called themselves the architects of night, masters of 1,000 systems blanketed in eternal eclipse. They studied us quietly, logging every reaction, every flicker of emotion, every pulse of fear at the absence of light. What they saw convinced them of a simple truth: humans feared the dark. Our cities burned electricity through the night, our streets lined with halogen defenses, our children lulled with glowing toys, and our stories filled with monsters that hid where light failed to reach. We trained our instincts to dread shadows, and to the Velkar, this was weakness. From their grand observation decks orbiting Saturn's shadowed moons, their analysts compiled data into declarations. They ranked Earth as a primitive anomaly. Innovative, yes. Capable of violence, certainly. But psychologically compromised, unfit for survival in darkness. They mistook our discomfort for terror, our illumination for dependency, and our stories as proof of trauma. Their final assessment: humans were too lightbound to ever pose a real threat. A species that floods their homes with daylight cannot bear the pressure of silence, the unknown, the cold, creeping weight of night. They labeled us the Lightwalkers, fragile, predictable, an empire built on candles, not teeth. So when the Velkar decided to invade, they didn't come with fire, they came with night. Their attack was methodical, strategic, and cruel. They didn't blast capitals or crater coastlines. They blacked us out. Power grids fell in silence. Communication towers vanished beneath blankets of pulsing shadow. Entire countries were plunged into void. Satellites went blind. Suborbital networks stuttered and died. It wasn't just darkness, it was the erasure of orientation. Cities vanished from maps. The stars above were shrouded by Velkar shadow craft. Daylight came slower, grayer, until even the sun seemed uncertain. They didn't fire warning shots. They landed with surgical precision in rural, unlit sectors, regions they believed least capable of resistance. Villages in Eastern Europe, outposts in Mongolia, farmlands across the Midwestern plains. They expected fear, screams, retreat. But the first Velkar drop crew never returned. What came back was shredded armor and radio silence. Then it happened again and again. Elite shadow troopers, armed with bioadaptive cloaks and silent phase blades, vanishing into human night. What they failed to grasp, what their centuries of surveillance never understood, was that humanity didn't fear the dark. We feared what waited in it. And more importantly, we prepared for it, in silence, in history, in blood. Long before electric lights, we hunted by starlight. We warred beneath clouds. We marched through fog, slept beneath trees, endured blizzards with nothing but instincts and fire. The dark wasn't an enemy, it was an old neighbor, a familiar pressure. And in it, we learned to listen harder, move quieter, strike faster. The Velkar troops that landed in Montana expected disarray. They found precision. Rural locals with night vision rigs and deer rifles hit them from 200 yards before they took 2 steps out of their drop pods. No sound, no light, just calibrated death. Hunters became snipers. Farmers laid traps older than Velkar history. Entire platoons bled out in cornfields without ever seeing their killers. They tried another site deep Appalachia. Mistake. Miners, bootleggers, survivalists, people who lived without light long before the grid ever arrived. Velkar recon forces were flanked, isolated, hunted in their own element. And still, they didn't understand. They increased pressure, dropped atmospheric shadows over major metropolitan areas, New York, Tokyo, Berlin. They expected panic. Instead, they got adaptation. Humans lit nothing. They went dark. Entire cities blacked out voluntarily. Neighborhoods, coordinated via analog signals, runners, flares, Morse code. In Los Angeles, rooftop spotters guided resistance teams using car mirrors and flashlight pulses. Velkar sensors overloaded with false readings. Their attempts to isolate targets only resulted in ambushes. Their darkness was no longer advantage, it was battlefield. A captured Velkar officer, bleeding under infrared restraints, asked his interrogator through fractured translator drones, "Why do your people not tremble in the dark?" The humana Coal miner turned resistance commander just stared. "Because we remember what lives there," he said. "And we remember how to kill it." Their arrogance ran deep. The Velkar saw our stories as evidence of fear. But they were warnings, not confessions, warnings to each other, to never forget what waits when the lights go out. They mistook our legends for weakness. But every myth they quoted was a survival manual. The monster under the bed taught us to listen. The shadow at the edge of the woods taught us to track. The faceless shape in the corner taught us to never relax. We were raised not to cower in darkness but to prepare for war inside it. And war came. By the time they realized we weren't running from the dark, it was too late. Their communication networks buckled under constant interference. Human Engineers College students and retired techs jammed their frequencies using repurposed satellite dishes. Software groups converted obsolete gaming servers into Velkar scramblers. Their soldiers began seeing illusions, hearing whispers in broken comms. Flashbangs were replaced with silence grenades, devices that swallowed all noise, isolating alien squads in absolute sensory deprivation. Their own tactics mirrored back at them. Every weapon they used became our blueprint. They dropped command units into the Rockies. None survived. The night air was filled with high-altitude drones, silent and cold, feeding coordinates to ground teams with homemade signal interceptors. They tried Antarctica, assuming we'd abandoned it. We hadn't. The base had been quiet for weeks deliberately. When they arrived, it detonated in preset charges, taking 3 of their cruisers with it. They thought we needed light to fight. What we needed was darkness to become who we really were. The final proof came when they attempted to raid a North Sea oil platform, long inactive, unlit, abandoned, a perfect target. Instead, the platform lit up with infrared strobes, blindsiding them. Divers emerged from the icy waters, unseen. A dozen Velkar Shadow Marines died screaming in the very element they once mastered. Their flagship above was hit by railguns hidden in dead rigs. They never saw the shots, only the aftermath. By then, whispers began spreading through their command hierarchy that humans were not afraid of the dark, that perhaps we had never been, and worse, that maybe we had always been waiting for something to meet us there. So the Velkar shifted tactics. They sent envoys instead of soldiers, and Earth turned off its lights. The entire planet dimmed for one night, not in surrender, not in fear, but as a message. We don't run from the dark, we are what lives in it. The Velkar tried to recalibrate. Their commanders, once confident in a swift psychological collapse of humanity, now scrambled to explain away the growing list of failures. Their war analysts suggested the initial wave was simply unlucky. Perhaps they had underestimated rural combat patterns or misjudged human terrain familiarity. But deep down, fear crept into their logic. They no longer spoke of dominance. They spoke of adjustment, and in doing so, they made their next fatal mistake. They brought more troops. The second wave was double the size of the first, heavily armed, reinforced with thermal disruptors, cloaking nodes, and elite Dreadvile operatives trained to navigate chaos. They deployed globally again, but this time into cities, places humans had already adapted into traps, cities that weren't asleep, but awake silently, violently awake. In Chicago, the Velkar stormed darkened skyscrapers expecting passive civilians. Instead, stairwells exploded, elevators were rigged, rooftops had snipers using wind and memory alone. No lights, no signals, just precision. In Sao Paulo, they deployed sonic destabilizers to induce panic. What they got was the collapse of their own equipment, disabled by homemade AMs crafted from microwave towers and drone batteries. In Johannesburg, a captured unit's data core was hacked mid-flight. Their coordinates were leaked live, resulting in a synchronized ambush from militias with no central command, no uniforms, and no mercy. They tried to adapt. Velkar troopers carried human sound libraries, hoping to psychologically manipulate us with screams, sirens, weeping children. It backfired. Humans responded with silence, with traps, with broadcasted recordings of wolves, ancient war drums, or unsettling laughter played backwards. The Velkar began to question whether their sensors were malfunctioning, or if they were losing their grip on reality. A new term emerged among human forces: night hunters. These were men and women who operated exclusively during blackout hours. No uniforms, no names, just kills. They painted their faces black, carried blades when ammo ran out, used thermal blankets to vanish from heat scans. They moved in the cold and struck like ghosts. One Velkar report described them as untraceable emotional anomalies, with no identifiable command structure. What they failed to realize was, they weren't anomalies. They were every human who had learned to operate without light, without orders, without hope, and fought anyway. In Alaska, an entire Velkar battalion was buried under an avalanche triggered by a mining crew that had been laying charges for weeks. In Siberia, an armored crawler vanished beneath a frozen lake lured in by a false heat signal. No shots were fired, no bodies found, just ice and silence. The Dominion began to understand they were not fighting soldiers. They were fighting memory or generations of human pain, innovation, and desperation compressed into thousands of individuals who knew nothing but adaptation. They deployed their Whisperlords, next telepathic tacticians designed to demoralize through fear and mental invasion. They touched human minds expecting terror. They found noise, a storm of overlapping thoughts, chaotic, primal, violent. One Whisperlord survived. Barely. He never spoke again, just stared into dark corners and flinched at his own shadow. The Velkar had believed fear of the dark was fear of the unknown. But for humans, the dark wasn't unknown. It was history. It was where we'd suffered and survived. It was where we learned to navigate grief, hunger, betrayal. And we're long before alien stars lit our skies. Darkness wasn't a void. It was a teacher. And it had taught us well. In Vietnam, jungle units used old trail systems and decades-old traps still hidden in forests. In Detroit, entire neighborhoods were evacuated quietly, turned into ambush zones lit by flickering lures, barely visible light sources that only attracted targets. One Velkar commander, after 3 failed raids, called for orbital support. By the time the request reached his fleet, he had vanished. Orbital strikes came. Flash bursts meant to ignite the atmosphere above target zones, hoping to reveal hidden forces. Instead, they fried their own team's optics. Humans responded by launching scrap satellites into low orbit filled with reflective panels that threw false signals, creating endless phantom targets. The Velkar lost more ships to misfires than to actual combat. They thought Earth's resistance was organic chaos. It was, in fact, coordinated improvisation. Our networks were not centralized. They didn't need to be. Every team was a cell, every individual a sensor. Data passed through handwritten notes, mirrored flashes, knock patterns, physical relays. Digital silence became our strategy. We went analog because they could not predict it. One human hacker embedded data packets inside cassette tapes dropped across battle zones. Velkar systems couldn't read the format, but kids on Earth knew exactly how. They began to lose patience. They assumed brute force would compensate, so they sent the night engines, giant walkers built for darkness, heat-shielded, soundless, invisible to thermal scans. In rural India, one of them crushed a resistance camp. Survivors fled. 2 nights later, the engine was gone. Found days later covered in tar, buried in a quarry, with dozens of broken pickaxes around it. No official military team claimed the kill. A local family hung a Velkar insignia on their barn. What the Velkar hadn't realized was that humans didn't just survive darkness, we celebrated it. Entire cultures built on night festivals, midnight prayers, lunar eclipses worshipped. Stories passed down in whispers. We wrote poetry about shadows, danced in moonlight, hunted at dusk. We feared the dark not because it scared us but because it reminded us of ourselves. The parts we didn't want to confront, the things we buried, the rage we tried to forget. And now, in war, that rage had returned. They attempted diplomacy. Next, sent coded messages promising negotiations, ceasefires, shared governance. The messages were met with nothing, not even rejection. Just silence. Earth had nothing to say. We were done talking. We had been talking when they came in the dark and tried to gut our world. It wasn't unity that saved us. It was defiance. It wasn't technology. It was instinct. The Velkar entered our homes thinking we were slaves to light. They didn't know we were just waiting for someone to turn it off. The Velkar's fleet regrouped beyond Earth's orbit, orbiting in cold silence as their losses mounted. They had never faced a species like this, so decentralized, so chaotic, yet so coordinated in its resistance. Earth hadn't responded like an empire or even a military. It responded like a storm, unpredictable, primal, everywhere at once. So the Velkar brought in their war architects, tactical minds bred in void chambers where no light existed, entities that had never seen a sun, who believed warfare was most effective when conducted in perfect blindness. Their conclusion was swift. Earth's error was its light. Their solution was a total blackout. They fired the Umber Ray, a low-orbit weapon designed to drop a synthetic veil over the planet, nullifying light across the visible spectrum. Sunlight dimmed to a gray haze. Nights became pitch black. Cities were cut off from solar panels. Satellites were eclipsed. Plants began to wither. The Velkar thought this would finish us, break our rhythm, collapse our systems. They were wrong. Darkness didn't disarm us. It unleashed us. Within hours, human engineers from a dozen countries adapted old tech diesel-powered generators, water-wheel dynamos, battery chains rebuilt from scavenged vehicles. Light wasn't restored. It was replaced with clarity. No longer reliant on infrastructure. Resistance teams used low-frequency comms and optical cables buried underground. In the absence of guidance from above, they looked inward. Subways became highways for soldiers. Abandoned malls became control centers. Libraries turned into war rooms. We built an empire out of the very silence they gave us. In North America, a civilian initiative called Darknet Ground surfaced entire information networks broadcast over analog TV frequencies, untraceable by Velkar sensors. In Africa, solar farmers linked their decentralized battery packs into a continent-wide power relay, lighting up only what they needed when they needed. South American jungles turned into black zones. No power, no emissions, only humans moving like wraiths, coordinated by handheld whistles and bird calls. The Velkar thought they had blinded us, but we had simply learned to see differently. Our weapons changed too. Where once we fired with guidance systems, now we struck with instinct. Our snipers became artists of timing. Our drones operated without GPS, using terrain memory and scent-based trail maps. Children built miniature scouts from broken toys that crawled under alien tanks and recorded their weaknesses. One of our greatest victories came not from missiles, but from silence. A Velkar ship landed in Greenland, attempting to claim a fuel node. For hours, nothing happened. No resistance. Then, the ground beneath them gave way. The entire glacier section had been hollowed. The ship dropped into a hand-dug ice cavern, rigged with pressure mines and lined with mirrors to blind any surviving camera. Not a single shot was fired, just a hole in the dark. The Dominion lost an entire command carrier without ever hearing a footstep. Psychological warfare followed, not from Earth's governments, but from its artists, its dreamers, its storytellers. Someone hacked Velkar broadcast frequencies and looped human nursery rhymes, distorted into minor chords. Entire platoons heard lullabies in unfamiliar languages echo through their helmets. On Europa Station, a captured human prisoner whispered a single phrase into a translator before biting through a power cable. The dark is patient. The phrase began appearing as graffiti across Velkar installations, scratched into hulls, scrawled on ceilings, carved into ice. No one knew how, or when, or who. We turned myth into weapon. Urban legends became real. Velkar troops began refusing to enter unlit zones. They feared the Black Choir, a rumored group of humans who hunted in total silence, marked by the humming of an old Earth song, Gloomy Sunday. Some claimed to see human figures standing motionless in forests, eyes gleaming only in infrared. Every trick they used: stealth, psychological disorientation, isolation. We turned back on them. Harder, meaner. They tried to cut our morale. They took prisoners, publicly executed them on hacked feeds. But for everyone they killed, 10 more rose. Some were veterans, others were children. A 12-year-old girl in the ruins of Warsaw rebuilt a downed drone and used it to paint targets on enemy vehicles. She was never found. Only her signature, Nocturne, left in chalk. The Velkar brought orbital superiority, but Earth brought madness. In the Black Oceans, submariners launched silent assaults. Entire cruisers disappeared. No explosion, just sonar silence. On the moon, a human excavation crew turned their dig site into a launchpad for ballistic crystal flares that scattered over Velkar flight paths, disorienting their guidance systems. On Mars, colonists surviving with limited oxygen fought in tunnels where darkness was already their habitat. Velkar units sent their lasted days. One by one, Dominion forces realized Earth wasn't a battlefield. It was a graveyard under construction. Our greatest weapon was not our firepower or our numbers or even our rage. It was our unpredictability. Every time they adapted, we adapted harder. Every time they predicted, we twisted the outcome. We laughed where they expected fear. We charged where they expected retreat. We played music when they demanded surrender, and we vanished when they tried to capture us. A transmission from a dying Velkar admiral encapsulated their failure. You cannot defeat a species that thrives on everything you fear. Earth's response: no words. Just a signal. An old Earth image beamed directly into their war council. A cave painting, thousands of years old, of a human with a torch standing before a beast made of shadows. Above it, scrawled in the Velkar language, "We've been here before." By the time they understood, the dark was no longer theirs. It was ours. We didn't just survive it. We remade it. Into weapon, into shelter, into legend. The night no longer belonged to the Velkar. It answered to Earth. The Velkar fleet stopped transmitting. Their ships, once symbols of total dominion, now drifted in the shadows beyond the moon. Systems failing, commands unanswered. Entire armadas had gone silent, not in surrender, but in confusion. They no longer understood what they were fighting. What began as a campaign against a primitive world had become a war against something they couldn't track, couldn't predict, and now couldn't reach. They sent one last envoy. It arrived in a silver pod, scorched from near-orbital panic launch, bearing no weapons, no demands, only a single request: negotiation. The pod landed in what was once Berlin, now a shattered city lit only by the weak flicker of recycled LEDs and the distant flash of arc welders rebuilding towers from wreckage. The emissary stepped into a world he did not recognize, and Earth let him walk unharmed through the ruins his people created. The leaders of Earth did not gather in a hall or sign a treaty. There was no grand speech, no broadcast of victory. Instead, they handed the Velkar a single folder. Inside were thousands of names, humans who had fought without medals, without commands, without even being recorded. The folder ended with a handwritten note: "This is who we are when the lights go out." The Velkar did not respond. They simply left, quietly, no declaration, no retaliation, just retreat. But the war was not over, not in spirit. What came after was not peace, it was transformation. Humanity no longer saw the dark as absence, but as a realm we had inherited. Colonies were built in asteroid shadows. Black glass stations floated in deep orbit, running silent, their human crews operating in low-spectrum suits that made them nearly invisible. Earth founded a new military division, the Silent Guard, trained exclusively in sensory deprivation, sub-zero combat, and void ambush tactics. Every recruit passed through days of isolation training. Every graduate earned the same mark, a black patch with no symbol, only texture. Alien species watched us with wary respect. Stories spread of Earth's gray war, a conflict not won by firepower, but by attrition of the soul. Survivors of Velkar occupation spoke in hushed tones about how humans didn't just fight in the dark, they became it. Across the galaxy, the phrase "beware the dark-born" entered diplomatic protocol. Some even lobbied to restrict human settlement near unlit systems. Too late. Humanity had already moved in. Old mining ships were retrofitted into colony transports and sent into black sectors of space. The Velkar had once considered sacred, unreachable. What the Dominion called the Deep Silence, Earth called New Territory. Settlements were named not for hope or peace, but for memory: Black Echo, Umbra's End, Widow's Rest, Gravelight Station. In schools, children no longer feared bedtime. Instead, they were taught how humans fought in silence. They listened to old field recordings from the war howls of storm winds, distant gunfire, Breathing in the dark, in art, the war wasn't romanticized. It was documented. Museums featured rooms that turned pitch black upon entry, leaving only sound, vibration, and whispered stories to guide the experience. People stood for hours in that void, trying to understand what it meant to survive without sight, to think like the enemy once thought and to win. But darkness had changed us. The war left a mark deeper than any crater. Humans began sleeping, with lights off, not out of rebellion, but reverence. Blackout drills were practiced not for threat, but tradition. Even celebrations changed. Every year, on the anniversary of the Valkar retreat, Earth shut off every artificial light for 1 full hour, not in mourning, but in remembrance. To remind the stars who held dominion now, our songs changed too. Once, we sang of sunlight, of morning, of warmth. Now, new songs emerged, quiet, rhythmic, built on the pulse of breath and heartbeat. Ballads of silence, anthems of shadow. The soldiers who survived, many never spoke of what they saw. They lived among us, unmarked, unheralded. But when they entered a room, silence followed. Not from fear, from respect. One word from them was enough. They had stared into something ancient and endless and emerged human. Some didn't return at all, not because they fell, because they stayed out there, in the dark, watching, waiting, because the war never truly ends. Not when you win with your instincts sharpened and your soul bared. Not when the dark still calls. Not when you know others will come and make the same mistake. The Valkar weren't the first to misjudge us. They won't be the last. Somewhere, in the void, another species is observing us, watching how we sleep, how we shine our lights, how we tell stories to keep the night at bay. And one day, they'll ask the same question. Why do humans fear the dark? And someone, somewhere, will answer, we don't. We just wait for someone else to.